A central feature of post-structuralist approaches in literary studies can be seen in the fact that the differences between literary and non-literary texts are largely leveled. The basis for this are Jacques Derrida's linguistic philosophical considerations, which lead from a semantic point of view to a unification of all texts. However, this unification neither stands up to a practical test, nor can it theoretically be justified. In my talk, however, I will only briefly discuss this theoretical aspect. Instead, the focus will be on a practical example, namely Jiří Weil's texts, whose logic refutes the post-structuralist conception of language. Moreover, in this way, the validity of the distinction between literature and non-literary texts generally, as theoretically founded by both structuralism and phenomenology, also is proven. In his deconstruction of logocentrism and thus also of Ferdinand de Saussure's conception of the sign, Derrida denies the sign the ability to represent extra-linguistic reality. Instead, he conceives of language as an infinite chain of references in which the signifiers themselves become signifieds. Accordingly, a language does not refer to the world, but only to itself. The consequence of this approach is a pan-fictionalism, since in the absence of a real-life referent, assertions can no longer be examined for their truth value in the sense of a correspondence theory of truth. But if an assertion can no longer be examined accordingly to whether it represents a fact correctly or falsely, this distinction consequently loses its function. Literature thus also loses its specificity, because until then it was literature's privilege to be exempt from the questions of the truth value of the assertions made in it. Instead now, the same semantic status is attributed to all texts so that they can be studied with the one and the same method. Michel Foucault provided this method with his discourse analysis. It allows for the comparison not only of texts of any kind, but also of artifacts from other semiotic systems, for example, paintings, photographs, films, and monuments. They all become comparable as soon as they deal with the same phenomenon, such as the Stalinist camps or the Holocaust, to name just two examples. The price for this is high, since thereby the specificity of the material and the communicative specificity of the respective artifacts are neglected. This fact is highly surprising, since post-structuralist approaches otherwise are concerned with emphasizing differences, for example, in order to help marginalized social groups to their rights. There is nothing at all wrong with this social-political goal, quite the contrary. But the path chosen for this, in turn, leads to the establishment of discourse sovereignty that excludes others. Because now only those who are affected by the respective marginalization are allowed to take a stand on certain topics. Only colored people are still allowed to speak about racism. Only women have the right to speak about women's issues, etc. If the truth value of statements was first radically questioned with a post-structuralist pan-fictionalism, it is now replaced in a next step by the category of authenticity, which is the one and only legitimation a speaker needs. The consequence of this is a shift of attention away from the linguistic utterance as such and towards its author. In other words, what matters is no longer what is said, but the question who says it. Therefore, the level of debate shifts in relation to the respective utterance. Instead of arguing about its plausibility, the respective speaker becomes the object of judgment or criticism, even defamation, from preconceived moral or ideological points of view. This phenomenon is well known from politics and the debates conducted in the most diverse media in recent decades. These remarks define the problem area we are dealing with here. My thesis is that a reflection on the logic of Jiří Weil's texts can help us to see through and remedy the social and epistemic misery caused by post-structuralism. Crucial in this context are two phenomena that raise the question of the connection between art and life from the perspective of literary theory. On the one hand, it is a matter of fact that Weil frequently used autobiographical material in his choice of subject matter, for example in his novels Moskva Ranice and Život, and not least in a large number of his short stories. On the other hand, it is also a matter of fact that he often treated this material in two different ways, especially in his shorter text, namely once in form of a narrative and once as a reportage. Weil obviously saw a difference between literary and non-literary texts, otherwise the distinction between narrative and reportage would be meaningless. In the following, I want to get to the bottom of this difference, whereby the categories of fictionality and fictitiousness will be at the center of my considerations. The category of fictitiousness refers to the ontological status of persons, objects, and facts. If they are classified as fictitious, this means that they have no counterpart in reality and thus exist only in the imagination. These fictitious persons, objects, and facts can in turn be represented in a text. Thus, all characters and actions in a fairy tale are undoubtedly to be regarded as fictitious. The same applies to the genre of fable, fantasy, and predominantly also science fiction. But even in novels that belong to the stylistic formation of realism, the characters and their actions are mostly fictitious, even if they are often acting in a setting modeled on real-life locations, such as when the action takes place in Prague, Berlin, Moscow, and so on. Fictitiousness was therefore long considered the domain of literature. However, this is by no means the case. This fact becomes immediately apparent when one thinks of the everyday narratives of dreams. Even if dreams are to be regarded as unconscious processes of experiences of reality, we are confronted mainly with fictitious entities in them. And conversely, of course, real entities can be represented in literary texts. This has already become clear in relation to the settings of the action. And in the historical novel, according to the conventions of this genre, we usually even encounter characters we know from real history. These characters then, as a rule, interact with fictitious characters and perform fictitious actions. In other words, and generally speaking, an author is completely free in his choice of the material. He can invent it or draw on historical material. And it is precisely the combination of both that often leads to particularly exciting effects in literature, for example, to counterfactual depictions, as in Vladimir Sorokin's novel Goluboye Sále, in which Hitler and Stalin meet in 1956 to divide up Europe. As readers, we accept this thought experiment, even though the facts presented quite obviously contradict the historical facts. Responsible for this is the phenomenon that the Romantic poet Samuel T. Coleridge called the willing suspension of disbelief from a poetological perspective. From an epistemological perspective, the philosopher Hans Weininger called this mode of thinking als ob, as if. In his Ontology of Literature entitled Das literarische Kunstwerk, the literary work of art from 1931, the phenomenologist Roman Ingarden became more concrete, distinguishing between genuine judgments in everyday life texts and quasi-judgments in literature. Today, this difference is terminologically grasped with a category of fictionality. This category does not refer to the ontological status of the depicted persons, objects, and actions, but to a special use of language in which they are presented. Normally, this use is not apparent to the language itself, yet we usually recognize it easily because of some textual, paratextual, and contextual conventions. If the use of language in a text is judged to be fictional, then the individual utterances made in it are precisely exempt from the questions of their truth value, or, to paraphrase the German philosopher Gottfried Gabriel, We are dealing with propositions in the form of assertions which have no assertive force with regard to the real world. That this distinction is extremely common and important is already shown by a few examples from everyday life. If, for example, we consider a request to pay taxes to be a fictional text and therefore do not comply with it, this decision naturally has consequences. The same applies to the case when we consider a ticket to be a fictional text. But the validity of the distinction can also be demonstrated in lesser clear-cut cases. An example of this is Benjamin Wilkomirski's text Bruchstücke, marketed as a memoir. Therefore, the text initially was read as non-fictional, so that the statements made in it about childhood experiences in 2 concentration camps were regarded to be true assertions. However, when it was proven that the text was a fake, the statements turned out to be lies. The truth value of assertions obviously plays a very important role. This becomes particularly clear when comparing autobiography with the autobiographical novel. Both text forms may well be based on the same material, but they are read in very different ways. Autobiography, as in the case of Wilkomirski, is regarded as a personal form of historiography in which the truth value of the statements is important. The knowledge conveyed in the text thus always refers to the individual historical case, which is also marked as individual by the name of the author. The autobiographical novel, on the other hand, is not concerned with the individual historical case. Rather, the life depicted in it is seen as exemplary for an entire group of persons, or perhaps even for mankind as a whole. Thus, the autobiographical novel in particular, and literature in general, are ultimately about the conditio humana, as already knew Aristotle. So when we read Moskva Ranice and Život by Jiří Weil, it may well be that these novels contain sentences that make true assertions about the author's individual life. But that is not what we are concerned with when we read them. Rather, the character of Jan Fischer, which undoubtedly has autobiographical features, stands as an example for all those who were victims of the Stalinist purges. One can even go further, since Fischer's fate is by no means limited to the historical situation in the Soviet Union, but is typical for all those who do not simply adapt to the political dictates in totalitarian societies. This is precisely the attraction of reading the novel even today. How the Stalinist terror regime functioned is now well researched. If you want to find out more about it, you can turn to the relevant literature by historians. Moskva Hranice, on the other hand, conveys a supra-individual and timeless idea of how an idealist can break as a result of the concrete experience of totalitarianism. Something comparable could be said about the character of Josef Robíček in Život, but now with a reference to the persecution of the Jews in Prague. The difference between autobiography and the autobiographical novel naturally also applies to so-called autofiction, in which the author ostentatiously makes himself the subject of the text. In comparison to the autobiographical novel, however, the use of the name of the concrete author for the protagonist blurs the boundary between fictional and non-fictional texts here, since the very procedures that actually apply to what Philippe Lejeune calls the autobiographical pact are used in a novel. However, this play with semantic status, as is familiar, for example, from the hexalogy, Mein Kampf by Karl Ove Knausgaard, merely confirms the existence and effectiveness of the boundary between fictional and non-fictional text by the irritation it causes. What I've explained here for the difference between autobiographies and autobiographical novels can be generalized for the distinction between literary and non-literary texts. I will conclude by illustrating this with Weil's short story, Švýcarská snídaně v Capulat. It describes the encounter of two Czechs in a street cafe in Paris, whereby the use of the names of real persons such as Léon Blum and Georges Bernanot, as well as the reference to the Spanish Civil War, make it possible to locate the time of the action relatively clearly in historical terms. The basic compositional principle of the text is contrast. Pepík, a Czech fighter in the Spanish Civil War, reports on the death of a comrade, the atrocities of war, and the difficulties of procuring weapons for the Republican side. In contrast, there is the carefree life in Paris and the celebrations of high society, which simply ignore the economic crisis and the threat of fascism. The short story ends with the narrator going to the Louvre to admire the statues on display there, while Pepík will return to Spain. The text may be autobiographical motivated, but this does not matter at all, for due to its fictionality, it would be a misreading to question whether Weil is making true statements about his life in it. Rather, the narrative conveys a sense of the bizarre situation at the end of the 1930s, in which the symptoms of crisis heralding the coming catastrophe were simply ignored. Nevertheless, today one does not read the text primarily for historical interest, of course, for if one wants to find out about the 1930s, there's a wealth of historiographical texts available for that purpose. Or of real interest is the question of whether the text still has something to say us today. It is whether the historical situation described can be related to the present context. And indeed, it can. In a situation of crisis like today's, in which social problems are highly acute worldwide and will become even more acute due to climate change, and in which a war is raging in the Ukraine, the text asks us to what extent we simply ignore these symptoms of crisis in order to live as carefree a life as possible. Of course, the text itself does not provide an answer to this question, but leaves it open to the reader. Of course, I am by no means the first to describe this logic of Jiří Weil's texts. Jiří Opelik came to similar conclusions as early as 1966, when he compared two texts by Weil with the same title, namely Čaj u Tomáše Bati. One text is a reportage that conveys the historical facts and thus focuses on the individual historical case, while the other is a short story that is based on the same real experiences of the author, but as a literary text lifts them on a general level. Even if my remarks thus more or less only confirm previous research results, rather than producing complete new ones, it seemed important to me to repeat them regarding the confusion that post-structuralism has caused in literary studies. Děkuji za pozornost.